All right. So today we have a beautiful icon, uh, Christ resurrected. Very similar to Orthodox. This is the Coptic version as well. You see that Christ is drawing out the those dead in sin. I think it's Adam and Eve. He's pulling out of the grave there, and his cross is trampling down the dragon. So he's kind of standing on the cross there, if you will, and being raised up, and he's pulling out of the tombs those patriarchs and those who have gone before, and bringing forth a host with him in glory. So I like this icon a lot. I don't know, Deacon Lawrence, is there anything else about the resurrection icon that we should be aware of that you know of?
I think what I'm used to is more to
Yeah, it probably is. This is a fairly simple rendition.
yeah. And
We could talk about that more,
yeah,
but as you know, I think all the great feasts of the church will have kind of its own visual tradition in iconography, and it's a great thing to reflect on. So we're going to be talking about the resurrection, my favorite part of the Bible, and we're going to be talking about the crucifixion as well today. So let's jump into it. So as you guys just talked about your groups, we talked about the foot washing last week, the betrayal foretold, the new commandment, the love commandment, the love to love like Christ. Denial foretold, Jesus declaring himself the way, the truth, and the life. The world will hate us. That cheering message. Talks about the work of the Spirit, the sorrow that will lead to joy and peace. And then we've concluded last week with a high priestly prayer of Christ. And we pick up the story today with all of this. So we'll see what we can get to. I'm going to try to get through all of this stuff, but a lot happens in these few chapters. We go from Jesus' arrest through all of the things related to his his condemnation, his crucifixion, his burial. John ends the book a couple times. And then there's this thing at the end with the apostles going fishing that we're going to talk about. So let's get into it. So we pick up our story kind of right. It seems to pick up after chapter 14 rather than after the high priestly prayer in its own kind of way. He says, let's get up and go. And so there's no like transition from his prayer that we had last week to this movement. So, John is not one to create very tight narratives all of the time. He kind of like drops you into something and then it has a lot of structure in it. And then he moves on to the next thing and doesn't always move clearly. So we're seeing Jesus. He's crossing the Kidron just like David did in 2 Samuel 15:23 to get to the Mount of Olives. Does anyone from your Samuel thing remember when Jesus crossed the Kidron to get to the Mount of Olives? What happened in chapter 15 of 2 Samuel? No one remembers. Interestingly enough, this is when David is betrayed. He's betrayed by his son and his counselor. And so his son was basically standing outside. Everyone who would come to get the king's counsel, he would say, well, I wish I could help you, but I'm not the king. If I was the king, I'd help you, but I'm not the king. So everyone's like, wow, this guy would be a great king. He would help me, if he was king. And so he came up with this plot where they would declare Absalom, his son, to be the king, and this crowd was with him. And so David has to flee Jerusalem. He flees from the Kidron. There, interestingly enough, the counselor that betrays him does go home eventually and hang himself. So there's some resonance there with the betrayal. But he's going to the Mount of Olives, to Gethsemane, which is an olive grove. And the way that John describes it is as a garden. So there's a lot of garden imagery that's happening here. And I can't help but think that's significant. I think that what we're seeing in the narrative from his betrayal to his burial is truly what we saw in that icon. Christ entering Eden, if you will. John's trying to say, like, Christ is entering into the place of authority that was given to humanity. And he is kind of instituting himself, if you will, as the proper gardener in paradise, if you will. So that's kind of what I think is happening in the background of this, because he uses imagery like garden to talk about what's happening here. We don't have a story of him going there and praying like we would have. We have the prayer of Christ in Gethsemane, Lord, take this cup from me. There's no record of that prayer here, unless for some reason we think that the high priestly prayer that Christ prays in the previous chapter is somehow related to it. Go ahead. But that's not included here. So they're at the garden, and it says that this troop of men shows up. And that's like a technical term in many cases for how many men would show up in a troop. And what it means is a tenth of a legion. So it would be 600 men, if that's a technical description. Now, maybe it's not a technical description, but when you're referring to troops, the amount that's described would typically be 600. So that's like an overwhelming number of people to show up for this small band. But maybe they weren't expecting a small band. Maybe they were really worried that Christ was gathering his forces on the mountain, or was calling folks to try to lead a rebellion. There were plenty of would-be messiahs throughout the history of this time period that sought to overthrow Rome. And in 70 AD, they succeed for a short period of time. That ultimately leads to Rome's retaliation and the destruction of the city and of the temple. So maybe that's why so many men show up. I don't know. But they show up and they ask, or Jesus asks them, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. And they all fall down. It's like one of those Benny Hinn meetings, I am he. Boom. They all fall down. And here's the incredible thing. Then they get up and they keep working at it. It's like, man, these guys are committed to their jobs. It's the antithesis of what we saw with the temple guard a few chapters before, where they send them out to arrest Jesus. They show up like days later, and they're like, where is he? And like, no man spoke like this man Jesus. Well, it's true. Here we have an actual no man spoke incident. Like the voice of Christ has literal power in it, and they still grab him and they take him. And so in the midst of all of this, the high priest's slave is wounded by Peter, who chops off his ear. And we don't have a story of the healing in John. We don't find out that the ear is healed. It's just, I guess it's good that we know that happens. Otherwise, this poor guy would still be bleeding or whatever. it was in response to Peter's action that the cup is brought up in John. So he doesn't have the prayer that says, you know, let the cup pass from me, but he basically tells Peter, no, this cup, I need to drink it. Peter often, like all of us, misunderstands how God wants to do things because he thinks that God likes to operate in the way that the world likes to operate. And so if a king is going to be established or whatever, or if your leader is being attacked by force, we respond in force. Which is kind of dumb because in the Synoptics we learned that the disciples had 2 swords total, and there's 600 guys. Like, Peter, it's not a good strategy, but that's his response. Maybe he thought, well, I've got the chosen one of God with me. Maybe my sword will, be able to, and his words just knocked down 600 guys. So imagine what my sword will do. And Jesus says, no, the power of God is somewhat different. In fact, it is this that is going to bring about ultimately the cup of what God has for me. And remember, over and over in John, we hear, what is it that Jesus does? He does what he sees the Father doing. For him, all that he does is obedience to the Father. So he gets arrested, and they take him to Annas. Annas, this is an interrogation that's not mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. I terribly misspelled Caiaphas, I think. So I apologize to Caiaphas. But Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He has been the high priest in the past. He had several relations that had been high priests. He's kind of the patriarch of the high priestly family, if you will. So he's not literally the high priest at the time, but he is probably the most powerful Jewish leader in Jerusalem. And so he's taken here. And it's at this kind of moment where he's being questioned that we really have the only time in John's narrative where at least the beloved disciple is separated from him. But then they show up, and the beloved disciple, John probably, is able to gain access. He's got some interconnections with this priestly family. And so they get him access. He brings Peter in, and as he's being brought in, someone recognizes him probably through his association with John and said, hey, are you one of Jesus' disciples? Aren't you one of his disciples? And we have the first denial of Peter at this point. So then the scene shifts, and we're back to Annas, who continues to question Jesus. Jesus shows some chutzpah here and talks to the high priest in a way that gets him struck, that hit him. Say, how dare you talk to the high priest this way? Jesus basically says, what have I done wrong? If there's something that I've done wrong, bring a witness against, which is a formal way of saying, like bring a real legal challenge. He's highlighting that what they're doing here is not a legal way of doing a proceeding. Grabbing a guy in the middle of the night, bringing him before the high priest, making accusations without witnesses, things like that. So he's doing that. But you have to remember, Jesus has already been convicted by the Sanhedrin at this point. After the death of Lazarus, Caiaphas had made a decision. If you remember, it's better for the one man to die than not. And so Annas seems to be convinced of the danger of Jesus at this point and sends him on bound. Scene shifts again to the apostles John and Peter, who are standing nearby in the house somewhere, and Peter gets questioned twice. First by one person say, hey, weren't you with him? And he's like, no. And then somebody who's like a relative of the guy whose ear he just chopped off is like, pretty sure you're the guy. You're the guy. I just saw you there. Weren't you there in the garden? And he goes, no, it wasn't me. Some other guy, which I guess makes sense if like a relative of a guy whose ear you just chopped off is asking, hey, are you the guy who just chopped off my cousin's ear? You're going to be nervous, but he does a third denial, and it says right here at this point, the cock crows, and that's the prophecy of Christ that's fulfilled, right? The sequence is a little bit different. In the Synoptic Gospels, Peter's denial comes when he's being questioned by the Sanhedrin, not when he's being questioned by Annas. So do with that what you will. There's some differences there. Like I've said before, John tends to arrange things around their significance rather than their primary chronology. That's my take on him, generally speaking. So for what it's worth, there's some differences there. Then we have Jesus taken before Pilate. So what we don't see is this back and forth with Herod and stuff that you would see in the Synoptics. We have Jesus taken before Pilate. And there are 7 scenes that continue this trend of kind of bouncing back and forth. And what we have is Jesus keeps getting taken outside and inside, outside and inside, outside and inside, and back outside again. And we learn sort of about why this is happening early on, because these Sanhedrin leaders, if you will, don't want to defile themselves before the day of preparation, which would be the day of preparing for the Passover, and it would also be a Sabbath. So if they went into this Gentile ruler's establishment, that would be ritual, make them ritually unclean and unable to participate in the feast the next day. Yeah.
How are they concerned about celebrating?
Oh yeah, isn't that interesting, right? So in John's gospel, Jesus didn't necessarily celebrate Passover. He had a meal with his disciples. And there are 4 ways you can reconcile this, right? There's way number 1, which is the simplest, but maybe the most uncomfortable way, which is saying that sometimes John plays fast and loose with what's happening. And even though the Synoptics say that the Last Supper was a Passover celebration, John is choosing to relay it as like happening before the Passover. And so he wants Jesus to die while the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. And so John chooses to have that happen. So that's option number 1. None of the other ones talk about the lambs being killed at the same time. They have Passover happen beforehand. However, there are plenty of people who have made efforts to synthesize these things. So there, for example, there were people who would celebrate Passover starting the evening before. And so maybe you could work it out that for some people, Passover began in the morning of Passover, but for some people, Passover began the eating of Passover. That one is a little bit tougher. And then there's another sect like Qumran, like the community at Qumran calculated Passover based on a solar calendar rather than a lunar calendar. And so maybe there were other segments of Judaism that were dealing with competing dates of Easter in Jerusalem that we don't know about, except for this text that might be indicating it. But there are precedences of people like trying to figure out when Passover is that might be slightly different dates. You can pick whichever one you want. They're all theories that are out there. I'm not going to try to tell you that I have the definitive answer on this, but that's how people kind of figure that out. Is actually in John's gospel, there's no real indication that Passover has happened yet. The only reason we think that if we only had John's gospel, there would be no reason to think that the supper that he had with his disciples was a Passover meal. So that is the non-answer to your question. So yeah, that's kind of the background. And it's really clear. John is making he's doing tons of work to put Jesus' death at the time of the sacrificing of the lambs for Passover. So he has all this talk about preparation and all this kind of stuff. So in his mind, there's a clear timeline of things. Whether or not that timeline is because he's saying this is the historical timeline, or what he's trying to do is say, this is the real significance of the feast. If there's anything we've learned from John's gospel is the Jewish festivals have real significance for him, whether it's the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Preparation, or the Feast of Hanukkah or whatever. He was doing the work, if you will, to trying to bring out the significance of how Christ relates to that feast in the actions of Christ during that feast. So he's clearly not making a mistake with what he's doing here, but how that relates to the historical celebration of Passover, that is the question. So Jewish leaders asked Pilate to sentence Jesus, and he's like, why don't you do it yourself? And they're like, we can't do it because it's capital crime. So he takes Jesus inside and asks Jesus to discuss true kingship. Then he goes back outside. He's like, I want to release this guy. Would you like him or Barabbas? And they say, we would like Barabbas. So then he goes back inside and he goes, all right, so this is the center of the chiasm, if you know the chiasm thing. It pivots, and so what we see is kind of it'll reverse and come back out from this point. He has Jesus is flogged. The soldiers beat him and mock him with royal imagery, including a crown of thorns. Interestingly enough, one of the commentaries I read talks about how date palms were probably the palms that were used for his triumphal entry, but were also very possibly the plant that was used for the thorns, because they had big, long thorns too. So it could be that the crown of thorns is made from the same plant as the palm branches that had welcomed him in. Interesting theory. Certainly doesn't say that in the text, but it could be the case. Pilate maintains that Jesus is innocent, but he fears accusation. The accusation that he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, Son of God is actually a term for Caesar. You guys familiar with this? For Caesar. So the coins would, like, there was a coin that came out at the birth of Augustus, right? It says, the Son of God has been born, because they have the cult related to Caesar, and they would often say Caesar is Lord as well. So there is some real tension for somebody to say, I am the Son of God. Not only are you making a religious claim, but you're potentially making a political claim as well. So he's nervous. This guy is talking about being king or being even the Son of God. So Pilate's nervous about this whole situation. So he brings Jesus back inside. They discuss true power. And then Pilate takes him outside, and basically, as a culmination of their own condemnation, the leaders he says, here's your king. And they said, we have no king but Caesar. And they've proven their true allegiance to Caesar above God or whatever at this point. And so Jesus is ultimately handed over at this point to be killed. He's handed over to be put to death. So, I missed that whole section there. So then we see the section of the crucifixion that comes right after that. And he puts a little placard above Jesus' head, as you can kind of see in this icon behind here. And written on it are three languages stating that this is the King of the Jews. And they're written in Hebrew and Latin and Greek. So Caesar makes a claim. I would say it's too small of a claim, but it's a truth claim nonetheless. But, the Jews have denied the kingship of Christ, but Christ is indeed the King of the Jews. and as it is indeed the king of the whole world. And so he is hung on the cross, and we see three Marys there. Mary, the wife of Clopas, who seems to be his aunt, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, his mother, are there. And so Jesus says these three things from the cross in John's gospel, not John's gospel. In John's gospel, he says to the beloved disciple, John, behold your mother. So Mary is there, and he says to John, behold your mother, which is a pretty powerful statement to entrust the care of his own mother to this beloved disciple. And this is where we find out that indeed John basically took care of Mary for the rest of however long she was on earth. So welcomed her into his home. And yeah. Maybe she was hanging out with him. I don't know. We don't get there's not a record of the full domestic situation. That's one thing we don't get is how it was. We don't really know how long Mary was around, but probably some fair amount of time. We don't have enough of a record of John's full itinerary. We do know that he was involved with the church. He's the last guy standing in the end, and we have the record of him being poisoned, but that not working. I think in exile to Patmos and things like that. But I don't really know how it worked out. Maybe they had a couple camels and went around. But the church wasn't. Not everyone in the church was Paul, right? So Paul was constantly on the move. A lot of people would, there's people who stayed in Jerusalem, like James, the brother of Jesus, seems to have stayed there. A lot of Jesus' family seems to be there. So it might have made sense for John to have stayed at least until Mary's death or Assumption, or however you want to read that. There's different ways of her dormition or whatever it is. Whenever Mary leaves this earth, maybe it's at that point that John begins to do some of the other stuff, but we don't have a clear timeline on it.
What's that is the same John?
Yeah.
John in Ephesus and the elder.
Yeah, it could be John the Elder. Could be the same John. I don't really know. Yeah, so I mean that could be it too. Maybe they go to Ephesus.
So there's some tradition of Mary.
Okay, yeah. So she's smarter than I am. She knows this Mary tradition in Ephesus. That's very possibly true. But although there's lots of traditions about a lot of different stuff, the text doesn't tell us, and so I'm kind of guessing. Tradition will tell us some stuff too, and maybe it is. Maybe that's the tradition. We could look into that. Does the church generally believe that they went to Ephesus? That could be the case. Behold your son, behold your mother. Once again, neither of them are given names. Interestingly enough, I think John, this is a theme. John never names Mary or himself in this gospel. And I think I've said this before. I think this is a way of him being humble and saying, hey, what's important is what Jesus did, not what I did. So, Jan, were you saying something? No, okay. So then he says, I thirst, and they bring him a sponge, and he has some of that, and then he says, it is finished, and then it says he bowed his head and died, which is, I think, is really powerful. There's two ways of dying. There's dying, and there's bowing your head and dying. So even in kind of, I guess, his taking on the posture of death. It's showing that he's choosing this, right? He's choosing to bow his head. He's not just slumping over, fighting against it or whatever. He kind of is embracing his death, and he enters into death. We could talk a lot about that. Why is this so significant? I'm going to just preach for a second here, not on the Gospel of John per se, but on this amazing moment in our life, which is that the God of the universe adopted our life in all of its brokenness, so that we might be adopted into the life of God in all of its fullness. The fathers of the church say that which Christ assumed, he healed. And so for me, this moment here where Christ enters into our death is really important, because we're talking about the King of the universe. There's so many great hymns in the church's history that talk about this moment here. Death being so hungry gobbles up even God himself, and gets caught, gets caught by Christ. So one of the images that the fathers would use would be like a fish being death, getting hooked by the cross, and that we're able to pull it out because it's so hungry it can't help itself. Jesus touches a leper, and when he touches a leper, he doesn't become unclean. The leper becomes clean. Jesus touches death, and rather than being overcome by death, death is overcome. And so, this is a powerful thing that we have to realize, like, why did Jesus die? There's a lot of people who answer this question a lot of different ways. There's a whole branch of theology called soteriology. It's all about how is it that we get saved. But for me, it really does come down to a God whose answer to suffering in the world is incarnation and solidarity with us, that he joins us in our suffering. But in that joining, he brings with him the power to overcome it. And so wherever we find brokenness in our world, we know that we have a God that does not fear to join us there. Is humble and loving. His love is so focused, beyond a self-giving love, I should say, so that we can have confidence in that. So, sermon is over. Jesus' death is important, and there's so much I would say. We're about to enter into Holy Week very soon, and I could probably recommend like 92 volumes on amazing things written about this. But I do encourage you to find some time to reflect in some way, whether it just be praying the stations or reading some good theological texts, or just sitting in front of the cross and asking God to show you how much he loves you. There's no other moment in history in which the depth of God's love for us is demonstrated so clearly as in this moment where he bows his head. He says, "It is finished." So the Jewish leaders are worried because the Sabbath is coming, and they have preparation, and there are laws in Deuteronomy about you can't leave somebody overnight hanging on a tree. Literally laws about that in Deuteronomy. So Jesus is hanging on this cross, or this tree, if you will. So they're really worried about becoming ritually unclean or whatever, or having this cursed man, bringing infidelity to the law upon them by the action. So they say, hey, we've got some people who are being crucified. Could you go and speed things up, if you will? Which is the process that would sometimes happen. Take a hammer and kind of break the legs. And when you break someone's legs, it's really hard to use them. So legs would be the thing that you use to push yourself up on a cross to be able to take a breath. if your legs are broken, you just would suffocate quite quickly. So it's a good way to kind of bring about death faster. They get to Jesus and he's already dead. So they don't break his bones. And this is an allusion to the Passover lamb whose bones aren't allowed to be broken in Exodus 12:46. And then they pierce his side, and they reference Zechariah 12:10. They will look on the one that they have pierced, and blood and water flow out of him, which I have to believe is significant to this early Christian community hearing this, that's celebrating baptism, that's celebrating the Eucharist, and recognizing that Christ dies, and like we said in our prayer, gushes forth from him this fountain of mercy that envelops the whole world. Like that's the theology of the prayer that we pray today. I love that image because I think that's there's a lot of, you'll find a lot of ink spilled on the biology of what's happening here, but what's most important is the theology, right? So you'll read in commentaries, they'll be like, well, they must have poked a sack around his heart and that's how blood and water came out, or maybe there's something else. There's another theological way of looking. I'm not sure how far I believe this, mostly because John doesn't seem to care that much what Greeks think. But there's a Greek tradition that gods wouldn't have blood. They would have like some kind of clear liquid, if you will, and humans would have blood. So if you have blood and water coming out, some people have said, well, this is John saying that he's both God and human. And that's a cool thing, but John is just so Jewish. Like, I don't think he cares at all what the Greeks would have thought about. So for me, it's blood and water. These images of water and blood are so rich in the Christian tradition. I don't think we need to go to the Greeks to figure out, what some of the significance there is. So that's my take on it. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea come. I say come out of hiding. We haven't seen much of them. They certainly haven't been willing to state that they're disciples. Nicodemus, we've seen a couple of times in the past. He showed up in John 3. He showed up again when they were debating what to do with this Jesus guy, and he was kind of a closeted supporter at this point. So he's kind of completed his journey. A lot of the characters in John are on journeys, which I really appreciate, because when I look at myself, I realize that God didn't make me a finished product. And so Nicodemus has been on this journey from secretly meeting with Jesus at night to now actually being willing to do something that for a Jewish leader at this time in this place is actually pretty remarkable. He's willing to handle the body of a condemned man. He's going, I will make myself ritually unclean. I will not participate in the festivities, if you will. I'll step myself out of celebrating Passover, and I will make sure that this man gets proper burial. So this is a powerful declaration for a member of the Sanhedrin. And so they show up. They apparently have 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes, which is more than you need. It's another example of like an overwhelming amount of something. This is like maybe the third example. There might be even more that I'm not thinking of, but we had the anointing of Jesus with an overwhelming amount of anointing at Bethany. We had this overwhelming number of troops that show up. We have this overwhelming amount of myrrh and aloes that are used. And what this means to say is they put him in a new term in the garden where he was crucified. So there's this garden imagery. They're saying, hey, there's this garden here, there's a tomb, he was crucified in this garden. And I can't help but think that's important. This continued reference to this garden. The garden that was lost. And John, I think, is saying, there's a new gardener in town. And so he's laid there because of the closeness to the evening. They want to make sure he's buried before nightfall. And so then it says on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. And anyone who's read Genesis chapter 1 should have alarm bells going off in their head when they hear that phrase. Because what's the first day of creation? When God creates the light. So John has demonstrated a couple of weeks so far, if you will. We had the week of calling his disciples. We had the 7 signs, and there's the 7 I am nominative passages. So that'd be like, I am the gate, I am the door, Jesus relating himself to these things. They have some of those. In addition to that, there are some other just I am statements. So I think this number 7 is key. I think what we've seen is John demonstrating maybe that in the person of Jesus, God, the God of creation, God, the God who brought forth creation, is shown up, which is explicitly stated in the prologue of this book. But here we are at the end of this book, and we sort of see, okay, so what does new creation look like? We've seen hints of it. We've seen it told, but on the first day of the week, when it was still dark, Mary arrives. Stones rolled away. She's a little concerned about that, doesn't go in, goes back to the disciples, says, hey, someone moved the stone. And so they race there. This is one of my favorite strange passages in scripture where John mentions I got there first. It's this is how you know that the beloved disciples are guy. He's got to mention I was there, I beat Peter, and you're okay. I don't know why that's significant. I'm sure there's some significance to it, but John shows up, but Peter goes in. He goes in and he sees first the clothing. And it's the first of 5 occurrences where we see faith arise. Someone sees something and then there's faith. So they see the cloth, and it says that the beloved disciples believes at this point. For some reason, him seeing the way that the clothes are there, he's oh, okay. And then they leave, and Mary comes and she sees some angels, and before they can explain what's going on, she hears a voice, and there's this gardener there, or at least she thinks it's a gardener. And so she turns to the incognito gardener and says, hey, where have they put him? And he says her name, Mary. And at that, she recognizes him. She recognizes him in his voice and her calling her by name. Rabboni, she says. And she believes. She sees him and believes. And it's the word of Jesus that stirs him. Then Jesus shows up with his disciples, and they see his wounds, and he breathes on them. It says, receive the Holy Spirit. Who's ever sins you forgive or forgiven, whoever sins you retain are retained. And then the 4th one is Thomas says, that's cool that you guys think that happened, but I would like to see his wounds. In fact, I'd like to even touch them. And Jesus shows up for him and says, okay, go for it. And he says, oh, my Lord, my God. And he makes the greatest confession of faith of all of them. And there's no record that he actually goes and touches him, but I think he sees and recognizes with the revelation of Christ's wounds to him. And then finally, Jesus talks about the future believers that will see and will believe, who won't see, but will believe based on the testimony those who have come before, who have seen. So he's talking about us. We are the fifth faith occurrence, if you will, in the gospel. We will believe. So yeah, we talked about this. Interesting with the Mary Magdalene, just backing up a little bit to the Mary Magdalene story. He says, "Don't touch me. I've not yet ascended to the Father," which is kind of a weird thing. So I thought maybe we'd talk about that for a second. I'll tell you how I read this. In the Greek, it can be translated. Oh, actually, in the Greek, it's attested in two different ways. So there's very few places in the New Testament where there's real question about what does the text say. We have like strong manuscript tradition for a lot of stuff, but there's a somewhat significant difference between manuscripts here, because in some of them it says don't touch me, and then in some the verb form indicates don't continue to touch me, indicating that she is touching him. He's saying you can let go now. So he's either saying don't touch me, or he's saying you can stop touching me. Like that matters a little bit, because the way I kind of read this, it makes most sense to me, is don't continue to touch me. And the way that I see this scene unfolding, if that is indeed the Greek word, is she is just desperately clinging to him. And he's telling her, hey, I'm here. I'm real. I've not yet ascended to the Father. Like, this is not a dream. You don't have to be like, I'm physically, you don't have to worry right now about that. The other way I don't really understand. Like, I can't see any reason why Jesus would not want to be touched, because he allows people to touch him. He invites Thomas shortly after to do just that. He eats with the disciples and seems to take great pains, if you will, to show that he is really a physically alive person. So that's kind of how I read it. And then he sends her. One of the things that's really interesting in our Western Rite tradition, at least, I don't know if this trickled into the Eastern Rite at all, but we changed the commons for Mary Magdalene. Her feast is now celebrated as the Feast of an Apostle. That happened a couple of years ago, because she's sent as an apostle to the apostles. She's literally, sent by Jesus to proclaim the word of God to the apostles. So she's considered the apostle of the apostles, and we actually changed how we celebrate the feast liturgically just a few years ago to I guess reflect that. I doubt, I don't know, Deacon Lawrence, did that trickle into the Eastern traditions at all, or is that?
Well, it wouldn't have trickled.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things, what was done in the early church and tried.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. It's one of the great things about being Catholic is we have different liturgical traditions that help emphasize different things. So yeah. But the cool thing is that we do have Mary as sent by Jesus himself on this mission of the apostles. He breathes on them to give them the Spirit. That Greek word is the same Greek word that's used in the Septuagint when they talk about God breathing into Adam to give him life. So I think this idea of kind of this restored Adam imagery continues here. Like now he's not just doing it himself, but he's giving this breath to these new people. There's two different words to talk about being sent. So apostolo is the first one. So as the Father has apostled me is literally what the Greek would have said there. Even so I pempo you, which is a different word meaning sending. Interestingly, I don't know what that means, like why he uses different Greek words there. But the idea is that this apostolic ministry is given in the sending. And he commissions the forgiveness of sins, which is pretty amazing. I'm always amazed by what God entrusts to us, and to entrust participation in the forgiveness of sins as a church is a pretty remarkable thing. I was commandeered this week to do confirmation interviews at my parish, where I have these students that come, and I had to see if they're ready for confirmation. And one of the things that they had me ask them is, do you realize that this is the same Holy Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, and that it inspired the apostles? Are you ready for that? So I mean, you already have it, but are you ready for more of that? Because by virtue of our baptism. But that I love talking. I mean, it was a real joy yesterday evening to be able to talk to all these young people, hear about their journey of faith. And it is amazing that we are sent as Christ was sent. We are given the Spirit that Christ was given. We have, as members of the body of Christ, a pretty amazing commission. And so then Thomas shows up. He hadn't gotten breathed on, but he makes the best confession of all. So I think that that's pretty cool. Spirit's at work. And I think that's a good way of showing this kind of cascading. Yeah, my Lord and my God is his confession, which is pretty awesome. And then we have this weird thing, which I think we want to talk about, which is we have the first ending. I put it down. I said, John tends to end things like Tolkien ends things. By that, I mean, if you read Lord of the Rings, it ends like 5 or 6 times, right? Some people think that this means that John intended it to end here, and then somebody else adds something at the end. Yeah, that's a theory. But I've read enough of John's writings where I go, this is just what John does. Like, he can't help himself. He's like, starts to wrap something up. And he's like, yeah, there's one more thing, right? So we had, earlier, we saw this even within the gospel. So you remember the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and then everything seems to have concluded, and Jesus is like removing himself from public life. And I said, then Jesus said in a loud voice, seems to, and then he gives that like the summation thing that happens in chapter 12. In John, 1 John 5, we have this happening as well, which we'll check in on very soon, where he seems to be ending, he's kind of putting a nice bow on things at the end of the first epistle of St. John. And then he's like, throw something else in there at the end. Or in the book of Revelation in chapter 22, you see what appears to be an ending, but then a little bit more. So I just think for one reason or another, John loves to do this. He likes to PS his writings, so that's my take on it. I think John loves to throw a PS on everything he does. But some people see it as problematic because it looks like he's wrapping up the book here, and then there's a whole nother story that shows up. Right? But he says, now Jesus did many signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So that was a wonderful book. Oh, wait, we have another story. The disciples are back fishing suddenly in Galilee. John doesn't tell us why they're in Galilee, but the synoptics do, because Jesus tells them to go to Galilee. So they're up in Galilee and they're fishing because Peter, like, I'm going to go fishing. And they're like, okay. So he's taking the lead, but he's not leading them in ministry. He's leading them in pre-ministry activities, right? Which is kind of interesting. I would say that the context of Peter here is he's living with his failure, right? He denied Christ. That seems to be really clearly what is happening here. And so he's failed to be a disciple, and he's also failed to be a fisherman. like he's in a rough day. He's like, well, I can't be a disciple. I denied my Lord 3 times. I guess I'll go back to fishing. And then he can't catch anything. And the poor guy. Oh my goodness. And so they see this guy on the shore, and he promises them that if they put the nets on the other side, they're going to have success. So they wildly decide that this random guy is better than a professional fisherman, and they do what he says, and they catch 153 fish, which is a wildly specific number. And the fact that it's wildly specific has caused no lack of commentary. I wish I could tell you that there's a specific reason for this number that I 100% agree with. But let me give you 3 or 4 that you could or could not agree with, right? So there's a passage in Ezekiel which says that when the Messiah comes, you'll be able to fish in between these 2 locations, the locations of the Dead Sea, which you can't have fish. Well, if you take those 2 locations and you figure out the numerical value of both of them and you add them together, is 153. So is it a fulfillment of Ezekiel 47:10, where they talk about the messianic coming and fish even being drawn from the Dead Sea? Maybe. Augustine goes, it's kind of interesting. If you add 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 all the way up to 17, it's 153. You're like, yeah, that is interesting. What does that mean? He's like, oh. He's like, it also interesting if you take 3 and you add 50 and 50 and 50 together, that's 153. You're like, you can do math, Augustine. He's like, yeah, I can. And 3 is in the Trinity. And you're like, yep, it is. Well, why the 50? So I don't know. And so Augustine goes, well, if you multiply 7 by 7, it's 1 less than 50. So if you add 1 to that, maybe that's the reason. You're like, okay, that could be it. I don't know, but you are very good at math. Thank you, Augustine. So then there's that. Jerome comes along and goes, all right, guys, here's the cool thing about this. Did you know that the Greeks believe that there's 153 different types of fish in the world? That's what the zoologists teach us. And you're like, that's amazing. That's got to be it, Jerome. You go and read the Greek zoologists, and they're like 157. So technically, like, they believe something else. So they're like, well, Joe, if that's right, then that's cool, because that means that we're supposed to bring in everybody into the kingdom of God, no matter what type of fish you are. And maybe that's what it is. That's kind of what I'm leaning towards, because maybe Jerome had a source that was 4 less. And maybe that's what John had. I don't know. I don't know why. Okay. If you know why it's 153 fish, you're better than me at figuring it out. You're better than like Augustine. Maybe he was right. Maybe Jerome's right. Maybe it's the Ezekiel thing. You'll probably find even a few other theories out there about like what this thing is, but I've been confused by it for years. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you, but I find it fascinating. Then they're eating breakfast together, and after eating breakfast with him, they recognize him, which is kind of like that Emmaus story where they recognize him, the breaking of the bread. So I think John is telling us, hey, you want to recognize Jesus? Have a meal with him. You'll find him there. So then we have this whole issue with, well, yeah, we're out of time. We'll quickly go over this. We're almost done. Peter is called by his former name, Simon. Ooh, that's gotta hurt. When the name that Jesus gave you, he stops calling you that. But he says, do you love me more than these? And commentators are like, what are these? Is he pointing to the fish, or is he pointing to the disciples? Like, and there's some truth to it. Like, are you willing to abandon being a fisherman to do this other thing? Or do you actually love me more than these guys do? It could be either one, the Greek. You choose your own adventure on that one. He says, do you agape me? And Peter says, I phileo you. So agape is the most perfect kind of selfless love. Phileo is kind of like familial love, brotherly love, Philadelphia, right? And so they go back and forth 3 times. Peter feels really hurt on the 3rd time, but the 3rd time he says, "Do you phileo me?" And so he meets Peter where he's at. He's not saying you've got to have that perfect love, but can you start with the love that you've got? Because Peter doesn't think he tried to be prideful before about how much he loved Jesus, and his humanity showed up, and it turns out that he didn't love Jesus as perfectly as he thought he did. So Jesus meets him and says, "I'm going to commission you with the love that you've got, that love that you can affirm that you got. I'm going to send you out with that." Tells him to tend his sheep and his lambs, feed his sheep, and foretells of his death, where he says, "Hey, you're going to basically die." And then there's this question about the beloved disciple. He's walking down the beach with them as they're talking, and Jesus is like, "You're going to die," and he goes, "Well, what about that guy?" And he goes, "Well, it's not your business. What happens to that guy?" And then that guy shows up and is like, "And by the way, guys, I was there. Jesus wasn't saying I wasn't going to die. He was just saying, mind your own business." So all those people who say that Jesus is going to come before I die, don't listen to those people. That's not what. So that's basically, finally, it gets to the real ending of the book. And it closes. We don't have a ascension narrative in John. Just kind of, Jesus is alive. He's alive and he's out there somewhere, which is a cool place to end it. So, because that's true. Sometimes I think we take the ascension to mean that Jesus isn't involved anymore. He's not at work anymore. John doesn't give us that choice. Jesus is still alive. So, that is the Gospel of John. We're at time today. So thank you everyone online. It was great to see you all. We will meet soon. Hope you all have a wonderful week.
Thank you. You too.
Hey, Billy,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Billy, can I ask you one question?